Sean "Diddy" Combs wasn't just a rapper or producer, he was an empire in motion, a cultural architect, a man who didn't just chase the American dream, he redefined it. From Harlem's rough and tumble streets to the pristine pages of Forbes, he crafted a public image of brilliance, swagger, and relentless ambition. Bad Boy Records wasn't just a label, it was a revolution. Under his watch, the careers of legends like Notorious B.I.G., Mace, and Faith Evans didn't just rise, they exploded. Diddy didn't stop at music. He became a mogul. His name turned to gold, literally slapped onto bottles of Ciroc vodka, sewn into Sean John jackets, and stamped on high-end media ventures. He dominated reality TV with Making the Band, turning even his mentoring into primetime entertainment. His brand was unmistakable: success at all costs, hustle above all, too. The world, he was a symbol of black excellence, a man who had outwitted the gatekeepers and sat, unapologetically, on his throne. But that throne, it seems, may have been built on something far more sinister. Behind the velvet ropes, beyond the champagne toasts and flashing cameras, there was a darker narrative, one whispered in backrooms, hinted at in tabloid blind items, and buried under settlements and sealed documents. There were murmurs of control, manipulation, even violence, stories that involved women, intimidation, and silent payoffs. Private jets that flew people in and then made sure they never spoke again. NDAs thicker than novels. Entire PR teams built not to promote, but to suppress. In the industry, people knew, but they didn't speak. Why would they? Diddy wasn't just powerful. He was untouchable. The kind of man who could turn your dreams into reality or make you disappear from the scene altogether. And money could erase a lot. Enough to keep scandals quiet, reputations polished, and critics unsure if they were dealing with a businessman or a myth. Yet, myths can only hold for so long. Now, decades after the first rumors, the silence is breaking. Federal agents have stepped in. Multiple witnesses, former staffers, bodyguards, women once celebrated as party guests are telling the same chilling stories. Tales of abuse hidden behind platinum records, of threats disguised as loyalty, of a man who wasn't just running an empire, but a silencing machine, because when you mix fame, fear, and fortune, the truth becomes the last thing people want to see. But now, for the first time, the world is watching and listening, and the king of Bad Boy may finally have to answer for the kingdom he built. In 2023, the long-simmering rumors surrounding Sean "Diddy" Combs erupted into public consciousness. What had for years been murmured in back channels and hinted at in vague industry gossip finally had a face and a name. Singer, model, and longtime partner Cassie Ventura stepped out of the shadows and filed a civil lawsuit that shook the entertainment world to its core. The complaint was not vague. It was a devastating point-by-point indictment of a man once idolized as a mogul of black success. Cassie accused Combs of a disturbing pattern of behavior spanning nearly a decade: physical abuse, manipulation, coercive control, and even sex trafficking. The lawsuit painted a picture of a man who used his wealth, influence, and access not just for business, but for total domination over those in his orbit. The most chilling allegations involved incidents of forced drug use, violent outbursts, and being coerced into non-consensual encounters with others, all while Combs allegedly filmed and orchestrated it. The public was stunned, but even more shocking than the allegations was how swiftly it all seemed to vanish. Within 24 hours, the case was settled. No drawn-out legal battle, no televised courtroom drama, just a quiet, sudden conclusion and a reported multi-million-dollar payout that silenced any further legal proceedings. No admission of guilt, no official statement of wrongdoing. Just a press release and a headline, And then silence, but the damage had already been done. Cassie's lawsuit had cracked the dam, and behind it was a flood of pain, fear, and buried stories. Within days, new women came forward, some by name, others cloaked in anonymity, but with disturbingly similar stories. Former employees, assistants, party guests, and even industry insiders began to describe a culture of control, excess, and fear surrounding Diddy's empire. Each account added weight to the idea that this wasn't an isolated incident, it was a pattern, a system. And while the public digested the avalanche of accusations, something else was happening quietly behind the scenes. The U.S. Department of Justice had already been watching. Long before the Cassie lawsuit hit the press, federal investigators had reportedly begun looking into Combs and his network. Financial transactions were flagged, private flights were tracked, whispered tips from insiders, once dismissed, were being compiled, cross-referenced, and corroborated. The civil case didn't start the investigation, but it certainly accelerated it. Now, prosecutors were circling in, armed with subpoenas, surveillance footage, and years of sealed documents. They weren't just interested in what Diddy had allegedly done to Cassie, they were unraveling the entire apparatus. A system built on NDAs, off-the-book payments, thank-you packages, and a trail of victims too scared or too paid off to speak. What began as a single brave voice had grown into a deafening chorus, and the empire that once seemed untouchable was beginning to show cracks that no amount of money could plaster over. The king of reinvention was now fighting to maintain the one thing he couldn't spin: his innocence. By 2025, the whispers had become headlines, the allegations had become testimonies, and the reckoning was now unmistakable. The dam finally broke with the release of a sweeping federal indictment that rocked not just the music industry, but the entire American pop culture landscape. Sean "Diddy" Combs, once the ultimate symbol of hustle and high life, now stood at the center of one of the most explosive criminal cases in entertainment history. The charges were staggering: sex trafficking, racketeering, witness tampering, and obstruction of justice. The indictment spanned more than 150 pages, each one packed with deeply unsettling detail. Prosecutors didn't claim Combs was merely abusive or criminal. They accused him of being the mastermind of an organized enterprise, a figure who used his fame and fortune to build something far darker than any of his public ventures. This wasn't about one victim or one incident. This was about a system. According to the federal documents, Combs orchestrated a highly structured network that allegedly existed for years in plain sight. It included handlers who scouted and recruited vulnerable women, often young, aspiring models or performers, drawn in by the promise of opportunity. There were managers and assistants who scheduled encounters, arranged travel, and maintained secrecy. There were lawyers allegedly complicit in the use of ironclad non-disclosure agreements, settlements, and shell companies to funnel hush money. And most chillingly, there were enforcers, people tasked with intimidating, monitoring, and if necessary, threatening those who might dare speak out. The indictment described how women were allegedly drugged, coerced into non-consensual acts, and then paid off or silenced. Some were allegedly trafficked across state lines to attend private events where cameras were rolling, and consent was a forgotten concept. If someone tried to leave or threatened to expose the truth, witness tampering followed: bribes, blackmail, or worse. One witness claimed she was followed for months. Another said she received a suitcase of cash with a note that simply read, "Forget." Prosecutors laid out a picture of not just abuse, but infrastructure, not just crime, but enterprise. The RICO charges, typically reserved for mafia cases, signaled what the Justice Department really believed: that this wasn't about celebrity misbehavior. This was a criminal organization with Combs at the top. The courtroom doors flung open in a media frenzy. It was no longer about music, branding, or business. This was about accountability at the highest level. The press dubbed it the celebrity trafficking trial, and inside, some of the biggest names in entertainment braced for subpoenas. Several former associates were already cooperating, flipping in exchange for leniency. Each day, the list of potential co-conspirators grew longer, and the walls around Combs' carefully curated empire began to collapse. For decades, Diddy had controlled the narrative. But in this courtroom, there would be no scripted reality show, no flashy ad campaign, no remix to spin, only the truth told under oath. And as the evidence piled up, one question haunted every headline. Was this the fall of a legend, or the unmasking of a monster? One of the trial's most explosive and damning moments came not from a celebrity, a former artist, or even one of the women at the center of the case. It came from someone largely invisible in the glittering world of fame, a former hotel security officer. Under oath, his voice calm but resolute, he recounted a chilling night in 2016 that, until then, had been buried beneath luxury, power, and a six-figure bribe. He had been working the night shift at an upscale hotel in Los Angeles, a property known for catering to A-listers and industry elites. That night, there had been noise complaints, shouting and cries coming from a private penthouse suite reserved under an alias frequently linked to Sean Diddy Combs. When security responded, the scene was tense and chaotic. A woman, clearly distressed, was attempting to leave, while members of Combs' entourage tried to de-escalate and shield the incident from further attention. What the guards saw on the security cameras, however, told a far more violent story. The footage, he testified, captured a physical altercation. Though the woman's face was partially obscured, her screams were audible. Combs, the witness claimed, appeared agitated, aggressive. There were slaps, shoves. Someone, possibly a member of his entourage, stood by the door, preventing her from escaping. Other staff members present on the floor had reported hearing glass shattering and a woman begging someone to stop. Following protocol, the officer wrote an incident report and flagged the footage for internal review. But the reaction that followed wasn't from hotel management or the police. Just 2 days later, he was approached in the hotel's underground garage by a sharply dressed man who identified himself only as a fixer. He didn't offer credentials. He didn't issue threats. Instead, he opened a briefcase. Inside, $100,000 in cash. All he asked in return, that the footage disappear, that no report be forwarded to the LAPD, that nothing about that night ever be mentioned again. This never happened, the man said with a smile. The officer, shaken and uncertain of the risks, took the money, and the evidence vanished. For years, it remained buried. Just another whispered story. Just another piece of darkness beneath the bright lights of celebrity, until now. The former officer came forward voluntarily, spurred by the unfolding federal case. He turned over what remained, partial logs, his original report, and details. Only an insider would know. His account sent shockwaves through the courtroom, not just because of the violence described, but because of what it represented. Prosecutors used it to introduce what they called the silencing machine. This was more than a cover-up. It was a blueprint, a recurring pattern where money was used to erase memories, intimidation replaced justice, and witnesses disappeared behind walls of luxury, fear, or financial comfort. The hotel incident wasn't an anomaly. It was the model, and the security guard's decision to finally speak marked a turning point in the trial, because his testimony showed that the machine wasn't a conspiracy theory. It was real, tangible, and ruthless. He ended his statement with a chilling reflection. I thought taking that money was survival, but watching the news years later, seeing more women, more victims, I realized I didn't erase a tape. I erased someone's chance to be believed. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just listening to a witness. It was hearing the gears of the silencing machine grind to a halt for the first time. The former hotel security officer's testimony cracked open the door. What came next blew it off its hinges. One by one, they stepped forward. Former bodyguards, personal assistants, housekeepers, drivers, and stylists. The people who once operated in the background of Sean Diddy Combs' glittering empire. Their stories painted a picture far darker than the public had ever imagined. A world where power shielded violence, where silence was bought, and where trauma was neatly packaged and disposed of. A former personal assistant, her voice trembling on the stand, described what she called routine damage control. She testified that after certain private gatherings, always high-end, always invitation only, she was instructed to prepare thank you packages. These weren't gift baskets. They were meticulously arranged offerings of designer handbags, diamond jewelry, stacks of cash, and pre-drafted NDA paperwork. She told the jury, sometimes the girls couldn't even walk straight. Their makeup smeared, their clothes torn. But we were trained not to ask. We handed them the bags and told them, you're good now, right? Another witness, a former member of Combs' personal security team, recounted an incident that took place during an exclusive, celebrity-filled party in Beverly Hills. According to his sworn statement, a young woman was assaulted by Combs in an upstairs suite after she reportedly rejected his advances. There were screams, guests heard them, staff heard them, but no one intervened. The next morning, the woman was gone, and in her place was a manila envelope slid quietly under her hotel room door. Inside, a non-disclosure agreement and a check for $250,000. I was told to escort her to the car and make sure she didn't speak to anyone on her way out, the security officer testified. She didn't say a word, just held that envelope like it was a grenade. Witness after witness told versions of the same story. Women who arrived with dreams and left in silence. Team members who were ordered to clean blood off hotel carpets. Housekeepers who were warned to look the other way. Lawyers who bragged about how tightly their contracts were written. Bodyguards who said their job wasn't to protect Diddy, but to protect the secret. One former music producer who once worked closely with Bad Boy Records put it bluntly, it wasn't about whether something happened, it was about how fast we could make it disappear. And yet, despite the money, the NDAs, the threats, not everyone stayed silent. Some had carried the weight for years, others had daughters of their own now. A few had reached a breaking point after seeing Cassie Ventura's lawsuit in 2023. Her voice, her bravery, gave them the courage to speak what they'd been burying for so long. One former housekeeper summed it up with heartbreaking clarity. We all told ourselves we were just doing a job, but deep down, we knew we were helping him get away with it. In the courtroom, the weight of their words hung heavy in the air. These weren't just isolated accounts. They were puzzle pieces, pieces that, when put together, revealed a machine fueled by ego, luxury, and fear. And at the center of that machine was a man who had once been celebrated as a mogul, a trailblazer, a king of the culture. Now he was being exposed as something else entirely. And the silence he'd paid so dearly to maintain was finally breaking, loudly, and for all the world to hear. As the trial pressed deeper into its most damning phase, the prosecution pulled back the curtain on what they called a factory of silence. It was methodical, chillingly organized, and most of all, consistent. Over 40 non-disclosure agreements, NDAs, were presented as evidence, each signed by individuals with direct or peripheral ties to Sean Diddy Combs. These weren't typical business NDAs protecting intellectual property or trade secrets. These were documents engineered to erase pain, suppress trauma, and eliminate risk to one man's reputation and empire. The individuals who signed them included alleged victims, personal staff, security team members, assistants, friends, and even a few up-and-coming artists who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Each agreement bore almost identical legal language, boilerplate phrasing designed to bind, threaten, and silence. The fine print included harsh penalties for breach, sometimes even clauses that allowed liquidation of assets or forfeiture of previously received payments if the signer ever spoke out, even anonymously. But what made the revelations more alarming was how the money moved. The prosecution traced payouts that ranged from $50,000 to over $2 million, all funneled through a maze of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and fake consulting firms. Some companies existed only on paper. Others were tied to Combs' broader entertainment ventures, disguising hush money as retainers, performance bonuses, or licensing fees. Former accountants, compelled to testify under subpoena, confirmed that some of these payments were coded internally as special HR resolutions. One federal investigator described the system as corporate laundering of abuse, but the emotional core of this expose came through the voice of a single brave woman. She testified publicly as Jane Doe number 7, though her identity was widely speculated. Her story began in 2019 after what was billed as an exclusive industry retreat on a private island. She said she had been invited under the premise of networking and possible brand partnerships. But one night, after drinking a spiked cocktail, she said she awoke disoriented and bruised, with Combs in the room. Her next memory? A lawyer placing a document in front of her, then a jet waiting on the tarmac, then the ocean breeze of a private residence in the Caribbean, a place she was told she could heal in peace if she stayed quiet. Alongside her was a $2 million wire transfer and a non-disclosure agreement already filled out, just waiting for her signature. She signed, but peace never came. She told the court she had lived in near isolation for almost a year, plagued by nightmares, unable to trust anyone. When the federal investigation gained steam and investigators reached out, she resisted. But when she saw other women testifying, particularly Cassie Ventura, something shifted. She returned. She testified, and the courtroom went silent as she concluded her harrowing story. I took the money thinking it would make it stop hurting, but money doesn't unbreak you. Speaking does. Her courage was electrifying. Prosecutors later called her testimony the turning point. Jurors leaned in. Reporters scribbled frantically. Even Combs, who had appeared stone-faced throughout much of the proceedings, reportedly dropped his gaze because her story, backed by wire transfers, flight manifests, and an identical NDA, was no longer just an allegation. It was proof of a system designed not just to harm, but to erase the harmed. The silencing machine wasn't just working behind closed doors. It had been institutionalized, industrialized, weaponized. But Jane Doe number 7's voice, strong, clear, and unwavering, pierced through it all. And in that moment, the empire began to shake. Not from scandal, but from truth, finally spoken aloud, as the weight of testimony grew heavier and more damning. Sean Diddy Combs finally broke his silence, not from the witness stand, but through his legal team and a carefully choreographed media campaign. He had pleaded not guilty to all charges, maintaining the same stoic calm he had worn through decades of scrutiny. But this time, the stakes were far greater than bad press or a scandalous headline. This time, his legacy, his freedom, was on. Trial.com's legal defense team, a high-priced lineup of elite criminal attorneys and reputation managers, immediately went on the offensive. They portrayed the charges not as legitimate legal grievances, but as a coordinated smear campaign, orchestrated by former associates, disgruntled employees, and opportunists driven by envy, revenge, or financial gain. To them, this wasn't about justice, it was about leverage. In court, they argued that the civil settlements and NDAs were not signs of guilt, but rather the unfortunate necessity of celebrity life, a means of shielding both Combs and his family from the circus of public scrutiny. When you're that famous, you don't fight every false allegation, one lawyer said during opening arguments. You protect your brand, your children, your peace. They leaned heavily on the theme of a modern-day witch hunt, the idea that Combs was being punished not for what he did, but for who he was. A powerful, wealthy black man who had risen from Harlem to Forbes and who now made an easy target in a society hungry for another fallen icon. They warned the jury not to confuse charisma with criminality or settlements with guilt. And then came Combs' own public statement, broadcast live, clipped for news outlets, and posted across social media. Dressed in a sharp suit and flanked by lawyers, he looked directly into the camera. I am innocent of all these charges. I have never trafficked, abused, or harmed anyone. I will not be destroyed by lies. I built my life, my career, and my legacy. Through hard work, I will not let falsehoods tear that down. It was the image of defiance, a man standing tall against the storm. But inside the courtroom, the storm had already made landfall. Jurors had listened, sometimes with tears in their eyes, as witness after witness described a pattern of control, coercion, violence, and cover-up. Former assistants talked about being asked to clean up blood and tears. Housekeepers described rooms that looked like crime scenes. Security staff spoke of being forced to escort terrified women into cars or flights, women who rarely returned. The prosecution didn't need to prove just one moment of guilt. They were building something bigger, a mosaic of manipulation, piece by piece, story by story, and each new testimony made the previous one more believable. The charm that once made Diddy a media darling now rang hollow. The charisma that lit up awards, shows, and sold records no longer moved the room. Not here. Not after the testimony of Jane Doe number 7. Not after a former stylist described a panic room where women were allegedly locked in for their own good. Not after a leaked email chain revealed lawyers coordinating settlements just hours after. An alleged assault. In this courtroom, power was no longer protection. Fame was no longer a shield. A former industry executive summed it up best when she testified, everyone used to say, that's just Diddy being Diddy. But now we see what that actually meant, and it's horrifying. And though Combs had built his career as the king of reinvention, there was no remix for this, no rebranding, no press tour, because the stories weren't just piling up, they were aligning. The names changed. The dates changed, but the behavior stayed the same, and for the first time in his empire-building life, Sean Combs wasn't in control of the narrative. The truth was, while the legal battle raged inside the courtroom, the collapse of Sean Diddy Combs' carefully constructed empire unfolded in real time beyond its walls. What had once been a blueprint for hip-hop moguldom, an untouchable fusion of music, fashion, television, and cultural capital, was now cracking at the foundation. The unraveling began quietly, with whispers from corporate boardrooms and behind the scenes, media executives. Then, like a chain reaction, the fallout accelerated. Endorsement deals disappeared overnight. Major brands that once proudly aligned with Combs, Ciroc, De Leon Tequila, and various fashion conglomerates terminated contracts or suspended collaborations indefinitely. His name was stripped from marketing campaigns. Social media teams scrubbed mentions. Licensing deals that had once minted millions were now dead weight, riddled with moral clauses. Investors fled. Crisis PR teams went silent. Revolt TV, his once celebrated black-owned media network, a platform he had championed as a vehicle for truth, empowerment, and creative independence, became radioactive. Advertisers withdrew en masse, some quietly. Others with public statements denouncing abuse and pledging support for survivors. Production halted. Internal emails leaked to the press revealed infighting and disillusionment within the company's leadership. For many, the network's original vision had now become a painful contradiction, a platform for voices that had, allegedly, been systemically silenced by its founder. The fashion world followed suit. Sean John, the brand he once paraded down runways, as a symbol of urban luxury, pulled its upcoming line from department stores. A long-anticipated designer collaboration slated for global release was abruptly shelved. Fashion houses distanced themselves with vague but unmistakable statements about reassessing partnerships. Bad Boy Records, once the pulsing heart of his empire, went quiet. Social media accounts stopped posting. Former staffers were laid off or reassigned. Artists who had long credited Combs with launching their careers suddenly found themselves in a moral crisis. Their back catalogs bore his signature. Their breakout hits had his name in the liner notes. Now the association felt radioactive. But it wasn't just the corporations that turned away. Longtime friends and allies began to disappear. Power players in music, film, and business, people who once toasted with him at the Grammys, posed on. Red carpets and publicly lauded his influence fell silent. Some deleted old posts. Others released carefully worded statements about believing survivors or supporting justice, conspicuously omitting his name. Even former protégés and collaborators began to distance themselves. A few spoke candidly in interviews about always knowing something felt off. Others kept their distance, but let their silence speak volumes. The public watched as Diddy's once invincible image corroded, his fan base fractured. For every supporter clinging to the notion of his innocence, dozens more shared stories, called for accountability, or revisited past interviews with newfound suspicion. The cultural narrative had turned. The question was no longer, did he do it? The testimonies, the NDAs, the corroborating evidence, these had begun to answer that. Now the question echoing through boardrooms, backrooms, and brunch tables was far more damning. How long did everyone know? How many had turned a blind eye? How many had accepted payouts, signed contracts, or stayed silent to protect their own access to the machine? How much of the industry had been complicit, not just in silence, but in enabling? The reckoning wasn't just about Combs anymore. It was about an entire system that allowed power to eclipse morality, fame to shield cruelty, and profit to quiet the cries of those it harmed. And as the empire burned down, what remained wasn't just a fallen icon, but a spotlight now turned toward everyone who helped him build the castle and everyone who helped hide the dungeon beneath it. As the trial stretches into its most critical phase, the tension is no longer confined to the courtroom. It pulses through the culture at large. Every day brings another revelation, another voice, another thread pulled from the once glamorous tapestry of Sean Diddy Combs' empire. Inside the courtroom, the air is heavy. Each new witness carries more than just testimony. They carry years of silence, suppressed trauma, and the weight of being disbelieved. What began as a legal proceeding has evolved into something else, a stage for reckoning, the kind of reckoning rarely seen at this level of fame and influence. More witnesses are expected. Many are former insiders, their NDAs now deemed invalid. Under subpoena, some arrive in disguise, under protection. Others speak through tears, recounting scenes of violence, coercion, or moments when they were told, explicitly or implicitly, that their suffering didn't matter so long as the brand stayed intact. The paper trail is damning. Federal forensic analysts have traced hundreds of transactions, some masked as business expenses, others hidden in shell companies. Emails, text messages, bank transfers, legal memos, the receipts are endless. Financial, Documents reveal a complex network of off-the-books payments, manipulated accounting, and shadowy intermediaries, all pointing to one central goal: silence. Each document entered into evidence becomes another nail in the coffin of the myth. The courtroom has become a revolving door of pain, secrets, and unresolved trauma. There are moments of stunned silence, gasps, audible sobs. Jurors exchange glances. Some can't meet the eyes of the witnesses. The sheer weight of it all is undeniable. And outside the courthouse, the media circus rages. Protesters line the sidewalk, some holding signs demanding justice for survivors, others defending Combs, citing the presumption of innocence. The cultural battle is in full swing. The prosecution calls the trial a historic turning point in celebrity. Accountability. This isn't just about Sean Combs, one prosecutor said during closing arguments. It's about the machine that protected him. It's about the cost of power when no one is willing to say no. Advocates agree. Survivor groups, Me Too activists, and legal watchdogs see this trial as a long overdue confrontation between wealth and justice, between image and truth. They're calling it the next chapter in dismantling the toxic underbelly of celebrity culture, a chapter written in the testimonies of those who were once voiceless. But the defense pushes back hard. They argue the case has been hijacked by public opinion, that the court is being influenced by media hysteria and social outrage, not facts. This is not a trial, one attorney declared. This is a public crucifixion, a rush to judgment wrapped in clickbait and trending hashtags. Still, despite the theatrics, the defense can't deny the tide is shifting, because every voice that steps forward, every check that gets traced, every NDA that's dissected under oath is a hammer blow to what was once considered unbreakable. And no matter the final verdict, whether Combs is convicted or acquitted, the damage is done. The carefully crafted image of Sean Diddy Combs, the mogul, the kingmaker, the American dream personified, has cracked beyond repair. The sparkle of awards and magazine covers now casts a shadow. The music still plays, but now it's laced with unease. The myth has collapsed, and in its place is something far more complicated, far more painful. A cautionary tale of what happens when power goes unchecked and a culture built on silence finally starts to listen. For years, the stories lived in shadows, buried beneath luxury and carefully calculated payouts. Millions of dollars changed hands, not for services or partnerships, but for silence. The silence of women broken and discarded. The silence of employees forced to look away. The silence of lawyers, publicists, and executives who knew just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be held accountable. But silence, it turns out, is never permanent. It decays, it festers, and eventually it erupts. No matter how carefully choreographed the cover-ups, no matter how polished the PR, the truth was always moving, slowly, patiently, toward the light. Now the cost is coming due. This trial is more than a criminal proceeding. It is a reckoning, a forced confrontation, not just with the actions of Sean Diddy Combs, but with the culture of complicity that protected him. For those who signed NDAs and cashed the checks, the courtroom is a bitter reflection. For those who buried evidence, redacted files, or pressured victims into silence, the judgment is no longer just legal, it's moral. The world is watching, not with admiration, but with grim fascination. Because this is no longer about a celebrity scandal. This is about the industry that enabled him, the power structures that whispered, "Don't ask questions." The gatekeepers who weighed ethics against endorsements and chose profit over people. And at the center of it all is the man who once commanded every room he walked into. Sean Combs was a master of the spotlight. He didn't just thrive in fame, he weaponized it. His image was curated, celebrated, and fed into the machinery of pop culture as a blueprint for success. a street kid turned mogul, a hustler turned king. But now, the spotlight has turned. Not to celebrate him, not to shower him with awards or praise, but to interrogate him, to peel back the layers of myth and expose what lay beneath, the stories he paid to bury, the people he tried to erase, the machine he built, not just to elevate himself, but to shield himself from consequence. And in a cruel twist of fate, it wasn't a rival that brought him down, not a corporate takedown or a label war, not a diss track or a failed venture. It was the people he paid to forget, finally remembering. They remembered the pain, they remembered the fear, they remembered the moment they were told, take the money and disappear. But they didn't. They came back with their voices, with their truths, with the kind of courage that money can't silence. And now, as Combs sits beneath the cold glare of the courtroom lights, his empire crumbling, his allies absent, his legacy on trial, he faces the most brutal reality of all. You can buy silence, but you can't buy redemption. Not when the truth refuses to stay quiet, not when the forgotten finally speak.